In a small town in rural Iowa, there lived an 11-year-old girl named Anouk. She wasn't famous, she wasn't rich, and she wasn't special in any way that stood out to most people. But Anouk had something that was rare, an awareness of the world around her that seemed far beyond her years. Her family had always worked hard. Her father worked the fields, and her mother helped at the local diner. They were the kind of people who got by, day after day, despite the odds. But lately, things had gotten harder. Money was tight, bills were piling up, and there was a constant sense that the world outside their small town was changing in ways they couldn't control. One evening, as Anouk sat quietly in her room, she overheard a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. Her parents were sitting at the kitchen table, their voices low, their words heavy with worry. They talked about the farm, about bills that couldn't be paid, about a future that felt like it was slipping further away. Anouk didn't say anything, but she listened, her heart tightening with every word. It wasn't just that they were struggling. It was the fear, the exhaustion in their voices, and the way they kept saying, "I don't know how much longer we can hold on." The next day, Anouk sat alone at her desk, her mind racing. She looked out the window at the fields that stretched for miles. She thought about the people in her town, the ones who worked every day, who gave everything they had, but still seemed to be falling behind. She thought about her parents, who were doing their best but couldn't escape the weight of a world that didn't seem to care. And then it hit her, something simple, something pure. She had a voice. She might be just a kid, but she could still say something that mattered. So, Anouk did something that most kids her age wouldn't think of. She wrote a letter. But not just any letter. She wrote to the President of the United States. "I don't know if he'll read it," she whispered to herself as she wrote, "but I have to try." In the letter, she poured out her thoughts. She wrote about her family, about the struggles they faced, about the way the world seemed to be growing colder and more divided. She spoke of hope that one day, the country could be a place where people took care of each other, where kindness was as important as power, where families didn't have to choose between keeping their homes and feeding their children. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope, her heart racing as she wondered if it would ever reach the person who needed to hear it most. Maybe it was a foolish idea. Maybe the letter would sit in a pile of forgotten mail. But in that moment, Anouk didn't care. She had said what needed to be said, and that was enough. "I don't know if he'll read it," Anouk said to herself again, but this time with a quiet certainty. "But I have to try." And with that, she sent it off, knowing full well that the letter might never change anything. But also knowing that she had done something powerful, she had used her voice. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Anouk's family wasn't wealthy. Her father's farm, once a source of pride for their small town, was no longer the lifeline it used to be. Market shifts, changing weather patterns, and rising costs had pushed them to the edge. Her mother worked at the local diner, doing the best she could to help, but it was clear that the struggle was wearing them all down. The town itself felt like it had been forgotten. Empty storefronts lined the main street, their windows cracked or covered in dust. The schools were underfunded, with programs cut back or entirely eliminated. It wasn't just a town, it was a place people left when they couldn't see a future. And for Anouk, it wasn't just about her family. It was the whole community. People had lived here for generations, but the sense of connection seemed to be slipping away, replaced by quiet desperation. Despite everything, Anouk wasn't one to give in to despair. She had an insatiable curiosity, a desire to understand the world around her. Her favorite place was the old bookshelf in the corner of their living room, piled high with books her grandfather had left behind. She wasn't interested in the usual kids' stories. Anouk loved reading history books, ones that spoke of past leaders, thinkers, and everyday people who had made a difference. She studied the lives of men and women who had stood up for what they believed in, even when their voices seemed too small to matter. Anouk had often wondered what it would be like to be one of those leaders. Not a president, not a politician, but someone who could make a real change in the world. She wasn't sure if that was even possible for someone like her, but she believed it was. It wasn't about power or fame, it was about doing what was right, no matter how small the step seemed. In the mornings, while her father tended to the fields and her mother worked, Anouk spent her time in that corner, reading books and writing down thoughts. Sometimes she'd share the ideas with her parents, small pieces of wisdom she picked up, bits of history that seemed to hold answers. Her parents would listen, but there was always the tired look in their eyes, the kind of look that made it clear they were too overwhelmed by the present to think about the future. But Anouk wasn't like that. She didn't let the weight of everything drag her down. Instead, she felt more determined than ever. She wondered, how could she help them? How could she help the town? What could a small voice like hers possibly do? Her thoughts would often drift to the president, the man leading the country. Was he hearing voices like hers? Did he even know what was happening in places like hers, in towns that had slipped through the cracks? And so, she wrote the letter. The simple words on that page were more than just a letter, they were a message to someone in power, a way to reach across the divide and say, this is what we need. A part of Anouk knew that the chances of the president reading it were slim, but there was a hope deep inside her that maybe, just maybe, something would change. What was she expecting from it? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But there was something powerful about taking that first step, saying, I'm here, and I matter. As she sealed the envelope, Anouk didn't know what would happen. Would the president read it? Would he understand? Or would it end up in the trash, just another forgotten voice in a sea of others? And then, as she stood there looking at the envelope, something shifted. She realized that whether or not the letter ever reached its destination, she had done something important. She had spoken up. How many people had ever thought their voice didn't matter? How many had stayed quiet, waiting for someone else to make a change? But here she was, Anouk, 11 years old, from a small town in Iowa, saying something, hoping it would make a difference. Do you think she will get an answer? Or was it all just a wasted effort? How often do we think our actions are too small to matter? Yet, sometimes, it's the smallest things that can have the biggest impact. What would you say if you had the chance to speak directly to the president? Would you be afraid to speak your truth, or would you take the chance to make your voice heard? Anouk couldn't sleep that night. She tossed and turned, the weight of her parents' words pressing against her chest. It wasn't the first time she'd heard them talk about how hard things had become. The small farm that had been in her family for generations was barely making it, and her father's voice had never sounded so heavy. It feels like no one cares about families like ours anymore, he'd said. That struck Anouk deeply. It echoed in her mind as she lay awake in the stillness of her room. She could feel her mother's worry, too. Her hands were always busy, wiping away the same tiredness, the same uncertainty. But Anouk wasn't like them, she didn't just accept things the way they were. There had to be something more to it, something that could make the world see what was happening. She wasn't just going to sit back and wait for someone to fix it. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting a soft glow on the small desk beside her bed. That was when Anouk decided. Without a second thought, she grabbed her notebook. It wasn't a grand speech, no plan for fame or recognition, just words from a girl who wanted someone to hear the truth. She didn't know if anyone would even read it, but she had to try. I have to tell him what's happening here, Anouk whispered to herself as she began writing. Her hand moved quickly across the pages. She wrote about the empty fields, the boarded-up shops, and the faces of people who had given up hope. She told him about her parents' struggles, but also about the beauty of the land they worked so hard to keep. It wasn't just about hardship, it was about who they were, what they believed in, and why their lives mattered. The words spilled out like they had been trapped inside her for too long. I don't know if he'll read it, she wrote, but I have to try. You have to know what it's like for people like us. We're still here. We're still trying. Anouk paused for a moment, feeling the weight of what she'd written. Could a letter like this really make a difference? She wasn't sure. But she knew that staying quiet wouldn't change anything. If anything, it would just let the world keep forgetting. What do you think, could a letter like Anouk's, written with nothing but truth and hope, really have the power to reach someone like the president? Would it be enough to make him take a closer look at what was happening in forgotten communities across the country? As she sealed the letter, Anouk couldn't help but wonder if her words would ever find their way to the desk of someone who could help. Could it really be that simple? Could one girl's letter change everything? Let's pause and think about that for a moment. How often do we hear stories about people standing up, speaking out, hoping their voice will be heard? What does it take to make a difference, even when you're just one small voice in a world full of noise? Share your thoughts below, we'd love to hear from you. As Anouk sealed the envelope, the adventure she had unknowingly started was just beginning. It wasn't about the letter anymore. It was about the hope that one person, no matter how small, could make a difference. And maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as indifferent as it seemed. The following day, Anouk mails the letter, tucking it into an envelope without much thought. She doesn't believe anything will change because of it, but a small, quiet hope lingers in her heart, a hope that someone, somewhere, might listen. Weeks pass, and the letter fades into the background of her life. The weight of daily struggles continues to press on her family, and the farm's future feels uncertain. Then, one evening, as Anouk is returning from her chores, her mother walks into the room holding something unexpected. It's a letter, stamped with an official seal. Anouk's eyes widen in disbelief. The return address reads the White House. She stands there frozen, her mind racing. Could it really be? Her heart pounds as she carefully opens the envelope. Inside is a letter written by someone she could hardly imagine, President Trump himself. The letter is brief but powerful. Dear Anouk, thank you for sharing your thoughts with me. Your words are a reminder of what it means to be a leader, and I will keep them in mind as I continue my work. You have shown the importance of understanding all voices in our country, no matter how small. Stay strong and keep speaking your truth. Sincerely, Donald J. Trump. Anouk sits on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she reads and rereads the letter. It doesn't promise any immediate changes, but it's something she never expected, a recognition of her words, of her voice. She reflects on what it means for a person like her, someone with no political power or connections, to have a moment like this. And then, something shifts. Anouk's story begins to spread. Word of the letter and the response from the president reaches the local news, and before long, the story gains traction online. It's no longer just about Anouk's letter, it's about the voice of a young girl speaking out for those who feel invisible. The story becomes a symbol of hope, hope that even the smallest voices can be heard, that no matter where you come from, your words matter. As Anouk sits on her porch, staring at the sunset, she wonders what will happen next. Will anything change? Will her community find the help it needs? She doesn't know. But she realizes something important. In a world that often feels divided and distant, the simple act of speaking up might be all it takes to make someone stop and listen. It's a lesson she won't forget. And it's a lesson the world is beginning to hear. What do you think would happen if more people found the courage to speak out, just like Anouk? Could a single voice truly make a difference in this world? The day after Anouk receives the letter from the president, she shares the news with her teacher. Mrs. Jensen, a kind-hearted woman who has always encouraged Anouk's curiosity, listens intently as Anouk reads the letter aloud. When she finishes, Mrs. Jensen's eyes are filled with tears. She puts a gentle hand on Anouk's shoulder and says, "You have a gift, Anouk. People need to hear this." It doesn't take long for Anouk's words to reach beyond the small town. At the school's annual event, Mrs. Jensen invites Anouk to stand in front of the class to read the letter. Anouk, despite her usual shyness, agrees. As she stands there, holding the letter, she feels the weight of the moment. Her classmates watch quietly, some with tears in their eyes. When she finishes, the room is silent for a moment, and then a slow, heartfelt applause fills the space. A few days later, the story takes another unexpected turn. A local journalist, visiting the school for a different story, overhears the conversation about Anouk's letter. Intrigued, he asks to speak with her. Anouk, uncertain of what to expect, agrees. After a brief interview, he writes an article titled, "An 11-year-old's Letter to the President Could Change Everything." It's a simple, straightforward headline, but it stirs something in the community. The article is published in the local paper, and soon, it's shared online. People from all corners of the country read about Anouk's letter. They're drawn in by her sincerity and the raw honesty of her words. The article sparks a conversation across social media, with countless individuals sharing their own stories of struggling in small towns, where the fight for survival can feel endless. Anouk's letter becomes more than just a simple request to the president, it becomes a symbol of rural America's voice, a reminder that no matter how far you're from the big cities, your struggles matter. It's the kind of story that stirs something deep inside people, a kind of quiet solidarity that doesn't need to be shouted from the rooftops to be heard. As the story spreads, people begin to reach out. Messages of support pour in, many offering help or sharing resources for struggling communities. A few even ask how they can contribute to Anouk's family, or others like them. The quiet voice of a child has sparked something that's much bigger than herself, an outpouring of empathy, and a genuine desire to change the way people see each other. It makes Anouk wonder, how far can a single act of kindness go? Can something as simple as a letter bring people together, even in the most unexpected ways? She never set out to become a symbol for anyone, and yet, here she is, her words spreading, not just through the town, but across the country. Do you think it's possible for a single act to change the course of things? How do you believe small voices can impact the world around them? The night after receiving Anouk's letter, President Trump sat alone in his office, the letter resting on his desk. The usual stack of papers and documents surrounding him was ignored, his attention consumed by the simple, handwritten words of an 11-year-old girl from rural Iowa. He picked it up again, rereading it in silence. Her words were straightforward, yet there was a sincerity to them he hadn't expected. A great leader helps people feel less alone. That line repeated in his mind, echoing louder than any briefing he had received that day. It felt different, almost personal. How many people had expressed the same frustrations, the same loneliness, in so many different ways? How many were out there just like Anouk, silently watching, silently waiting for someone to notice? The next morning, when the usual stream of meetings began, something had changed in him. A different perspective, a shift in focus. He asked his advisors about the struggles in small-town America, in the heartland, where communities like Anouk's were hanging on by a thread. It wasn't just about policy anymore. It wasn't about the usual figures and numbers. For a moment, it was about the people, the real families, like Anouk's, who were slipping through the cracks. And just like that, a quiet conversation began to stir in the halls of Washington, something sparked by the innocent yet powerful words of a child who had simply asked for a little help. What would it take for leaders to truly listen? To understand the realities of people like Anouk, who were watching and waiting for change? What do you think? Can one voice, even from a small town, really make a difference? What would you say if you had the chance to speak to someone in power? As weeks passed, something unexpected began to unfold. Anouk's simple letter, written late one sleepless night, had sparked a wave. People, young and old, from every corner of the country, picked up their pens or keyboards and shared their own stories, their own frustrations. Their voices echoed Anouk's, and each letter was a plea for change, for someone to listen. Anouk didn't expect a response. She didn't expect to change anything. But soon, the mail started arriving. Letters from strangers, from people whose names she didn't know and whose lives she could never have imagined. Thank you for speaking up. Thank you for reminding us that we still matter. It was overwhelming, this quiet bond she had formed with so many. At school, Anouk stood in front of her classmates one day and read aloud a letter from someone in a faraway state, someone who had been moved by her words. The class listened in silence, and Anouk, in that moment, realized something. Her voice, small and simple, had reached places she never could have imagined. She learned that even the smallest voice can have an impact, that one letter, written from the heart, can spark a conversation, a movement. It didn't matter how old she was. It didn't matter how small her town was. What mattered was that she had spoken her truth. And maybe that's something we all need to be reminded of. Sometimes, we think our voices don't matter, that our actions won't make a difference. But Anouk's story shows us that they do. Every voice counts. Every person matters. So, next time you feel like your words don't carry weight, remember Anouk. Remember the power of a simple act of kindness, of speaking up when no one else will. Sometimes, it takes a child to remind us of the values we hold dear, kindness, unity, and hope. What do you think? Have you ever been inspired to act after hearing a voice that spoke from the heart? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters.